this gets to the false dichotomy you presented Bill with, though, because you presented him with a choice between introduce bears and they kill lots of people, or don't introduce bears and people run amok.
Oh, no. Because, I mean, I guess in the wild animal example, there could be other...
Yeah, exactly.
Other
You
ways
could
in which we can help
reintroduce
as well.
You could reintroduce bears, but also introduce ways to keep them from hurting people if you wanted to.
Right, but Bill isn't in favour of introducing wolves but stopping them from eating the deer. He's in favour of introducing wolves also, and they eat the deer. So I think it's a fair hypothetical to give. Welcome back, everybody, to the Humane Hangouts podcast. Today, I have the absolute pleasure of being joined by not one, but two research scientists. We have Bill Lynn of Clark University, and Bill's realm of expertise covers conservationism, rewilding, sustainability science, animal ethics, and more. I'm also delighted to have Michelle Graham, Executive Director of Wild Animal Initiative, an organisation who have a focus on encouraging and facilitating research on wild animal welfare, with their ultimate aim being to make life better for wild animals. So Bill, Michelle, thank you so much for finding the time to be here.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, great to be here.
We're going to be having a discussion about the emerging ethical questions in conservation and wildlife management, and hopefully we'll be able to delve deep into the ethics relating to wild animals. But I think a good place to start is perhaps to define a few terms. So let's start with conservationism. What exactly is it? Bill, I think you're perhaps the best person to take on this question.
Well, conservation is a large animal, and it's a species in the sense that there are various versions of conservation. One version of conservation is about the management of natural resources. And so we look at animals and ecosystems and landscapes as just resources for human beings and how to manage that. That started when there were problems with resource scarcities and resource disasters. Massive forest fires after logging in the United States would be a good example of that. There's another version of conservation that people are probably more aware of today, and that has to do with the protection and restoration of biodiversity. And that really is sort of the baseline of European colonialism. What kind of nature was around back then when Europeans exploded across the planet? And then trying to preserve that biodiversity now and into the future. And the third is more associated with sustainability. And the sustainability version of conservation doesn't reject concerns about managing natural resources well or preserving biodiversity, but is interested in sustaining the community of life, individuals as well as communities, ecological communities, social communities, people, animals, and nature, sustaining that community of life into the indefinite future. So that's sort of the three broad areas of what conservation is.
Right. And is there a specific perspective that you take? Where do you fall into this with your own personal views on conservation?
I fall into the latter one, the one that's more influenced by sustainability. And my version of sustainability is very informed by ethics. It's very normative. So it's how ought we live in the world? How ought we coexist with other people, animals, and nature in order to sustain our biological and cultural diversity indefinitely into the future.
Mm-hmm. And Michelle, could you tell us a bit about what wild animal welfare is and why it matters?
Yeah, so wild animal welfare is the perspective, as an ethical perspective, I will say. I think you can have a wild animal welfare as a research discipline and not necessarily care about the normative perspective, but at Wild Animal Initiative, we care about both. So from the normative perspective, saying what should you do about wild animals or with wild animals, what are our responsibilities toward them, etc. The perspective of wild animal welfare that Wild Animal Initiative promotes is to say, what is the quality of life of animals living in the wild, and how do we improve it and ensure that it's good? You can combine that with different ethical views. So you could have, just like you could have different ethical views towards people, you might have like a view about we have a duty to maximize the well-being of all people, or you might just say we have a duty to avoid causing harm. You could, in theory, have a wild animal welfare view that extends those one or the other of those perspectives just towards wild individual animals that are not humans. At Wild Animal Initiative, we kind of and many other people calling themselves wild animal welfare advocates right now have a consequentialist view of what that means. And what that means, that term consequentialist, means that we're focused on the consequences of our actions for animals. So the measure of whether an action that you undertake for animals or an action you fail to undertake for animals, the measure of whether that is good is just whether the quality of life for the animal in question is going up or down bad, up good. So it's a little complicated because I wouldn't say there's like one person who's written the treatise on wild animal welfare. And so there's only one thing it means to be someone who cares about wild animal welfare. So in very broad strokes, it just means you care about the quality of life of individual animals having experiences out in the wild. But if you're taking a consequentialist perspective on that, you might say the more animals having the highest quality of life they can, the better.
And when it comes to research on wild animal welfare, I suppose someone could question, where the hell do you start with that? Maybe you could give us some examples of the kind of things that Wild Animal Initiative are looking into and trying to study.
Yeah, so I like to think about all the ways that we try to make human welfare better. So we all have biological needs as animals. We have the need to eat to sustain our lives, and we feel pain in the form of hunger. If we don't eat, we feel bad if we get a disease or an injury. We feel bad if we don't have the social connections we need. And so our biology and our species kind of, not totally, obviously different individuals have different needs, but have something to say, a large part to say about what we need to thrive. And the same thing is true for a lot of animals. But the problem is we often don't know exactly what those things are. So for all animals, we know that they need some kind of energy input to continue their life in the form, food. And so that's an easy one. You could just start saying what percentage of animals are experiencing hunger on a regular basis. That's something you could start investigating by, documenting animal experiences. You could, for example, set up camera traps and document what percentage of animals who walk by the camera are emaciated. So first question is just, what are the problems that animals face? And we can use our own intuitions and our own understanding of their biology to start guessing at what those problems might be. And then we can go out in nature and check whether those things that we thought are problems are actually happening and to what extent. And if you have a sort of maximization outlook on welfare, where you're saying, I want welfare to be as good as possible, you might prioritize the problem that is hurting the most individuals. So you might say, okay, that's the most serious thing because the most individuals are suffering from that. Or you might prioritize the issue that is causing the most intense feelings. I think we all know that there's a difference between stubbing your toe and breaking an arm. So you might think through what's causing the most intense feelings. And some of those things are really hard to measure. So that's another area of research for wild animal welfare, is just figuring out how we measure how much of a problem something is, both in terms of how many animals it's affecting and in terms of what the actual subjective experience of the animal is. So those were just kind of illustrative. If I broke it down into concrete, main questions, I'd say the main questions we try to pursue at Wild Animal Initiative are, what is the quality of life of animals living in the wild? And not just for, a particular animal species that we care a lot about, like a particular tiger or something that many people find interesting, but also like a bug. What is the average experience of a ladybug? Do ladybugs have experiences that we should care about? That's an important question that we should find out the answer to. And then after that, where we identify what the quality of life for different groups of animals are, how can we help them? And then how can we measure what the impact of our efforts actually has been? So that's the main questions that we pursue at Wild Animal Initiative.
Right, thanks for that. So you got this perspective where you think that if an action that affects wild animals increases utility, improves well-being, then you'd say it was good. If it causes suffering, reduces well-being, then it's bad, simplistically.
But it does, if you want to think about all animals as much as possible equally, so you're not prioritizing a particular animal over another just because they're cute or we like them, we're saying all animals are equally worthwhile, and then, maybe there's differences in their capacities. I think we got to look to the science to help us answer that question. So maybe a particular species just has more capacity for positive experiences, and so we should prioritize them over an animal that only in its day-to-day life experiences stubbed toe level problems. But we don't even know that. So that would, So it's hard to say exact. I guess I never like to say anything simply. What you said is not wrong. But there's always going to be caveats of like, you've got to think through, I don't know, does somehow taking that action impact my ability to help other animals more down the line? Or, when I say, well, plus welfare good, do I even know how to measure plus welfare? So, making sure we actually know that before we're just arbitrarily like assuming that X thing is good for welfare and saying increasing that is good then.
Got it. Nuance. Right.
Yes, what you said, but also nuance.
And Bill, so when it comes to the relationship of humans with nature and your perspective with conservation and sustainability, how do you measure success?
I think you measure it in two ways, and it's not a quantitative measurement on my end as an ethicist, but it's more along the lines of what we sometimes call covenantal ethics or sometimes ethics of care, that we are manifesting a moral appreciation for other animals, because we're animals too, and the natural world. And through that, we're conducting sort of strict, not just scientific scrutiny of our actions in the world, but also ethical scrutiny, trying to figure out whether what we're doing is right or wrong. Try to figure the consequentialist impact is very, very important, although it's not the only dynamic to be thought about in that regard. And in that way, improve our ability to coexist with other people, animals, and the rest of nature.
Mm-hmm. When you say appreciate nature and how we impact nature, do you feel that nature has like an instrumental value in how it affects the animals that live there, or is it actually that do you see some kind of intrinsic value in nature?
I see both. In fact, let me put it like this. In most animal and environmental ethics, there's a kind of simplistic way of distinguishing or bifurcating instrumental value, or what's originally called extrinsic value, from intrinsic value. And people get caught in a box of saying, well, only individuals have intrinsic value. And maybe the environment has only instrumental value, or and those are called biocentrists. Then there's the ecocentrists who say, well, only nature as a whole, or ecological wholes, ecosystems, biomes, species, populations have intrinsic value, and individual animals don't count. And that just has never made sense to me. I think all of us are characterized by both intrinsic and instrumental values. My employer cares about me most in terms of what I can do for them, which is an instrumental relationship. My cat Cleo clearly loves me as sort of an intrinsic and values me as a sort of an intrinsic being, as a person in her life. Same thing is true with our ecological and social relationships. There's always elements of intrinsic and instrumental value interladen. I call them co-values. So for me, I don't feel that you need to choose between the animal and the environment. Or between people and the non-human world. All of them are sources of intrinsic value. All of them have instrumental relationships at the same time. And the key is contextually thinking about which set of relationships, which set of values are important and insightful and give you guidance about how you live your life in the world.
Michelle, I'm wondering if you have any differences in your perspective here. I mean, how do you... when you think about your values, do you place an intrinsic value in nature, or is it just that you care about, I suppose, the experience of the beings who live there?
I think there's a different intuitive answer to like my felt answer and my thought answer are different to this question. So as a matter of my feelings, do I feel as though like it would be a tragedy even if there were absolutely no sentient beings on Earth, if Earth was like a just a rock sphere instead of a green sphere? Yeah, it feels that way to me, definitely. And that would suggest that it has intrinsic value, that even if nobody was around to appreciate it, it would still be bad if it didn't exist. But I have trouble justifying that to myself logically. So the way that I kind of approach my ethics tends to be if I ask why a lot. So, when I say, well, why would it matter if, Earth was just a bare rock if no one was around to appreciate it? And I don't have an answer to that. And I think different people might have answers to that, and that's fine. But for me, it doesn't feel meaningful to say that it truly, it's hard for me to see a picture where it really has intrinsic value. And so when I ask why it's so important that we have nature, it feels like it's important because it enables people to appreciate it and have, value from it. Either it sustains their lives or it's beautiful to them. And so that paints a picture of nature as being a really important instrumental value, thing to have around, but not necessarily intrinsically valuable.
Interesting. There's one thing to say here is that there are forms of conservation that do look at nature as simply having instrumental value. So the resources, and it's just a set of resources for us. There's also neoliberal and Marxist versions of this. The neoliberal one is called New Conservation and really prioritizes the creation of social justice through the uses of nature, the instrumental uses of nature. The Marxist one is called sometimes social nature. It sometimes flies under the banner of political ecology. And it basically says nature doesn't even exist. It's just a material world. Nature is a concept, and we can use it and remake it however it is that we want. But there's other forms of conservation that think of, and I'm thinking of rewilding and compassionate conservation, that think of nature as having intrinsic value, not just because it exists, so-called inherent value. It's the product of millennium of evolutionary ecology, which has produced some remarkable life forms and periods of life on the planet. And there's something of value there, but because it's composed of living beings, of wild lives. If we're not around to appreciate the natural world, it doesn't matter, because there's lots of other creatures who live in and are also part of the larger community of life. And for the reasons of their existence and their existence in that complex ecological social communities of which they take part, that's a bearer of intrinsic value as well.
Yeah, and I should clarify when I say if no one else was around to perceive it, I don't just mean if there were no humans. I mean no sentient beings. So, I view nature as being valuable to the extent that it provides value in the form of happiness and well-being to those sentient things that live in it.
And I suppose if it was that nature was important, it had value because of how it affected the animals that lived in it, that would surely still be the instrumental value, right? It wouldn't mean that we place an intrinsic value in nature.
Some people do think that living beings, and and people talk about living beings in a range of beings. Some include plants, some only include animals, some only include really intelligent, very conscious animals, but they think that living beings are the center of moral value, and their environments, nature, broadly understood, are of instrumental importance. Now, because we don't live on a spaceship, and we're dependent and embedded in the natural world, so you have to protect nature, but you're protecting nature for the benefit of the beings that live there. I'm someone who believes, while that's true, you should protect nature for the benefit of the beings that live there, that communities are bearers of intrinsic value as well as individuals. So you should protect nature for itself. And they're tightly interconnected in that way.
The concept of instrumental value being this very clear-cut distinction from when something has inherent value, like things with inherent value are only those things that are virtuous in and of themselves. There's no reason why they have value external to themselves. Like many people would say well-being, and then money is only valuable because it makes me happy. It's not having that money alone is not valuable. That very clear-cut distinction between those two things is a very consequentialist mindset It's not very like holistic ethics mindset.
And I don't share that at all.
Yeah.
I don't think of intrinsic value as just a sort of a non-material, spiritual, or some kind of other property that we just have and you just intuit it or understand it. That is the moral intuitionist perspective on intrinsic value. It's much more about the properties we manifest as being sentient, sapient, social, aware, self-aware, interacting with others, which are generally the justifications analytically that we give for valuing ourselves and that we see in other creatures as well. So the capacities of creatures are really important for me in determining different kinds of intrinsic value. I never think about treating a krill in the same way I would a baleen whale, even though I recognize they're both living beings and they have probably are conscious. I think we know the whale's conscious. We think the krill might be conscious, but they might share very different kinds of consciousness.
I suppose this is where perhaps I'm not quite understanding your perspective, and I suppose like nature is like an abstract concept, I suppose, in that it doesn't have a capacity to suffer. It doesn't have desires or goals. So why is it that we would say that nature has some kind of value in and of itself, as in if there were no sentient beings at all on this planet, there would still be a value there? Where does that come from?
Let's think about the presupposition behind that. And the presupposition there is that you have to be a being in order to have intrinsic value. Why is that the case?
A rock, for instance, has no interests. It hasn't got an interest in avoiding being kicked. Whereas if you look at a non-human animal, it does have that interest. It's going to create something unpleasant if I kick it. And so it doesn't matter to the rock whether or not I kick it, but it does matter to the deer or the mouse.
Yes, and you're talking about very different entities, and you're absolutely right. I think you're absolutely right about that. Arnie Nace has a nice way of framing this. He talks about it in terms of nested levels of self-realization. What he basically means is that we don't exist as disembodied spirits called beings who have intrinsic value all on our own. Disappear in nature and we all die. We're just floating out in space and we all die. We're actually deeply nested, rooted, embedded in a natural world that is full of other beings, other processes, other communities. And those are bearers of intrinsic value, different kinds of intrinsic value, not the same kind of intrinsic value that human persons and non-human persons might have, but still bearers of value. So it's an attempt to step for Arnie Nace. Arnie Nace would totally agree with you. So would Mary Midglin, of the importance of thinking about selves, about persons, about living beings with consciousness and or abilities to feel and suffer or perhaps experience pleasure. But that's not to say that we can't think about intrinsic moral value when it comes to larger entities than just individuals.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I mean, I guess I'm still not fully understanding, but I don't want to get bogged down on the whole intrinsic instrumental thing at this point.
I think the thing is, we could go back and forth and debate whether it's right or whether it's wrong. I think the important thing if I'm here in part to represent a conservation perspective, is many conservationists say nature has an intrinsic value of its own. And some of them say only nature, only ecological collectives have intrinsic value, and the wild individuals don't matter. They're just functional units of ecosystems. And that is a source of tension. I have a tension with that because obviously I care about those individuals, but that would also be in real tension with what Michelle and her group are doing because they're so concerned about the well-being of individual animals, in part because they recognize the intrinsic value of those animals. Is that fair, Michelle?
Yeah, that's fair. And I do think that to get away from the definitional of the, clarifying what is and is not an intrinsic value, because I do think that terminology can sometimes like if two people are on the same wavelength about how to use those terms, you end up not having a productive discussion. So I kind of like to take things back to how would you respond to a practical question given that value difference. And so one of them is like, okay, if we do a lot of research and we find out that, it's a very natural condition, say, that trees grow to a particular height. And that's like the natural case of that tree. And we find out that for some reason, if that tree were like modified to grow to like 20 feet shorter, there would be all these benefits to sentient individuals living on that tree. To what extent does the fact of the tree being naturally 20 feet taller enter into your moral calculation? And at Wild Animal Initiative, it wouldn't enter in at all, because the tree, assuming plants are not sentient, let's give me that. So let's give me that for a second. Let's assume the tree doesn't care.
So now she doesn't care about nuance anymore.
Let me say the tree doesn't care, and let me say that we have the capacity to modify the species of tree so that it only grows to be 20 feet shorter than it would naturally, and that has all these benefits for the animals living on the tree. Some people would say you can't do that because that's going against what's natural. Some people would say you can do that, but I counted in my head that the tree would be deviating from natural. And I weighed that up against the benefit to the animals and decided the benefit of the animals was more important, but I still considered the fact that the tree would be doing something not natural for that species, or that species would be permanently altered, that deviation from what's natural or what naturally evolved. I considered that in the calculation. And then the wild animal perspective would say, or the wild animal initiative, wild animal welfare movement perspective would kind of say, the only thing that mattered was the welfare. The tree didn't contribute anything to the welfare conversation because it doesn't have any welfare in this model. So it just didn't even enter into the calculation. And so you would just, assuming there was, no knock-on effects, nothing more complicated to say, it's just a straightforward, modify this tree to be 20 feet shorter, many animals benefit. It would be like a definitely good action.
So, Bill, I'm wondering how you feel about this example. Would it bother you at all that the tree, there was an intervention which called a deviation in what's natural?
Yes and no. The yes side is about human hubris. Not that Michelle's being hubristic by raising this point, but I'm very skeptical about the capacity of human beings to alter not just a tree. A tree is one thing, and there's lots of different varieties of trees that have been bred over time. And that doesn't so concern me. And it wouldn't concern me if that tree was altered and was appropriately placed in the sort of let's say, a built environment. But if we were to think about doing that broadly in the natural world, that's when I would become concerned, because I don't think we're wise enough. I don't think we're good enough as beings not to abuse that power and avoid negative knock-on effects. But I also think that I'm like Michelle. I'm like the second person Michelle referenced. I'd be open to the question, but I'd also think about the question of, is this change in sort of a natural teleonomy, the many things that this tree could be, whether it's an acorn and becomes food or grows up into an oak. Is that change going to be good for those trees and for the creatures that live in those trees?
When you say good for those trees, what exactly do you mean there?
Trees themselves, there's lots of debate now about what kind of neurosystems trees and other plants have, their communications between them, and what is good for their well-being. Their well-being may not be a conscious well-being like ours is, like many of the animals that we care about, but they can still be healthy. They can still fall ill. They can have that can have consequences for the well-being of other plants and animals around them. So in that sense, thinking about naturalists and the natural perspective, or in a natural perspective, just causes you to stop and consider what are the consequences of your actions, whether the intentions of your actions are good or not, or justified or not.
Sure. I really don't want to do this thing that I can sometimes do when I'm talking to people where I get stuck on like definitions of words. But I suppose like using the term well-being to talk about like the health or the intelligence of plants, I suppose I wouldn't use that term because I generally think its well-being is referring to some kind of conscious experience. But I understand that that's not how you mean to use the term. And I completely understand also the concern in how we don't really understand ecosystems properly. They're so complex, and there could be knock-on effects. Let's say we change the length of the trees, and then that causes other changes down in other parts of the ecosystem. Hypothetically, though, let's say that we had very robust evidence that this would, in fact, make things better for the well-being of animals overall. So it's not going to affect the well-being of other animals negatively. Hypothetically, I understand it's a lot more complicated than that, and there's a lot more nuance. But if you had some degree of confidence that this would be an intervention that improved the lives of the animals living within the ecosystem, would you be in favor of making that intervention happen?
I'd be positively disposed. But the devil's in the details, of course. Sure, we can talk about thought experiment in this way, but to go back to Michelle's really well taken practicality, is in practice doing this going to be a good thing for all involved? I just want to take a step back, and I know this is getting back into definitions. Well-being is sometimes reduced to welfare in terms of the welfare of individuals, but the concept of well-being is an Anglo-Saxon term that is a translation of the Old Greek eudaimonia, meaning to flourish or meaning to thrive. To thrive and flourish has looks a certain way for human beings, or might look a different way, but in a way that we can sometimes, that is comparable if we're talking about cats or lions or whales. Physical integrity, psychological integrity, good social relationships, a salubrious environment in which you can live your lives. But that doesn't mean the concept of well-being can't be applied to larger entities in the natural world. Ecosystem health is a good example of this. The use of that version of well-being that's called health to try and understand whether an ecosystem as a whole is thriving, and that ecosystem as a whole is also composed of individuals itself and has an impact on their well-being as well. So it's thinking of well-being at different sort of scales of analysis or scales of existence, so to speak.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point to bring up, because while I think it's common within the vegan community to focus entirely on subjective experience as like the metric of welfare, and only care about flourishing to the extent that it translates into an experience of joy or suffering, to use those as two kind of sides of a coin. That's probably not the dominant view in the world. So even, if there's people who are listening to this podcast who don't find this framing intuitive, I'm with you, but at the same time, I think it's really important to try to understand it and try to find commonality, because I would say the dominant perspective in the world is not to reduce well-being to exclusively the psychological or the affective state, as it's often termed. We can think about this even just applied to humans. I think the concept of a brain in a vat is a common philosophical concept, where someone asks the question of, if you found out that your entire life was like a fake simulation, like you were just a brain in a case, and someone was programming you, let's pretend you were programmed to have like an amazing life. It was just so good. Like these stimulus you were getting, you're just like living your joyous best life every single day. Do you care that you're actually a brain in a vat? And some people answer that question, no. Like, all I want is the positive psychological experiences. And some people answer that question of like, yes, that's really creepy and weird. And like the difference between exclusively having good psychological health with no other physical kind of health. You don't even have a body to have a healthy, flourishing body in a physical sense. Some people answer that question with like that yeah, they would care a lot that they were a brain in a vat. And I think there's sometimes skepticism from the people who are brain in a vat positive people, that the other people are fooling themselves, but like it's just as fair for the other people to say that I'm a brain in a vat person, to say that we're fooling ourselves. So I think just, approaching each other with a little bit of forgiveness for the differences in underlying philosophy, and focusing more on what do you actually want to do out in the world given this case is kind of, I think, more practical for actually getting things done.
Mm-hmm. Since we're talking about nature, I think it's kind of interesting to perhaps get your opinions on some misconceptions that people have about nature. Since I'm living in a concrete city here, or maybe I'm just a brain in a vat, I don't know. But we're very much kind of apart from nature now. We're very comfortable. But let's start with you, Michelle. What ways in which do you think are the common misconceptions as about nature?
Yeah, so I think I like that Bill just brought up the concept of ecosystem flourishing, because I do have a sense of what it means for an ecosystem to be flourishing. And what that means is that it's operating in a sustainable way. It's not collapsing. It has certain components, water, maybe particular kinds of plants, depending on the biome, particular animal makeup. Those animals are reproducing and continuing generation and generation. They're, et cetera. And I think one misconception is that ecosystem flourishing translates to individual flourishing. I think that's just not true. And so an ecosystem can be doing really well. Like each species in that ecosystem is continuing generation to generation. There's not collapsing. They're in balance with each other. Nobody's, overrunning the place, like, rabbits breeding out of control, and nobody's falling into extinction. But even when you have a stable population, let's say a stable population of rabbits, every year those rabbits produce way more young than can survive to adulthood. And so those individual rabbits that are born, those juveniles that die, live a very short period of time, and we don't know that much about what's happening to them in their lives. And it would be reasonable to assume that their lives could be very stressful. I'm not saying that it is, because I don't think we have the data, but it would be a reasonable assumption, because if you imagine coming into the world, you have a brief period of parental care where maybe things are okay, but then why didn't you survive to adulthood? Probably you were eaten, like just looking at the statistics of how rabbits die. Probably you were eaten, which sounds like it would suck. Or maybe you died from a disease. Getting that disease, living with it for a period of time, and then it was serious enough to kill you. That sounds pretty bad. Also, those are probably the most common ways animals die. Maybe you were run over by a car. That's statistically less likely, but just based on causes of death in rabbits, that off the top of my head. But it does, obviously that does happen as well. That one actually might be pretty quick. That might be one of the better ways to go. I don't know. But all those things I'm saying I have to be massively caveated by the fact that we just don't have the research to fully understand this. But if you assume that it's reasonable to say those things, those ways of dying would involve a lot of suffering, and that you only lived for a very short time, and maybe even while you were alive, you had a disease very early that didn't kill you right away, but you were not thriving the whole time. That just sounds like a life, either that is too short to make up for the badness of death, if you, in your moral system, give death a value of badness, or possibly was so bad it wasn't worth coming into existence at all. Like it was so full of suffering. And I would never say I know this. I just think the question really deserves research, because if it is the case that a stable population contains many individuals who are having a really bad time, then that's pretty clear that those individuals are not flourishing, and they far outnumber the number of individuals that do make it to adulthood. And then even the animals that make it to adulthood, I regularly see adult animals with broken limbs, or some bad condition, or like a mite, or, various things that make me think they might not be having a great time. And then other things where I'm less certain, but I'd like to know. Like, I'd like to know how an animal feels about being out in the rain. Maybe they don't mind. I personally would, but I obviously live a very different, I don't want to sleep out in the rain and the cold, but maybe they're used to it, maybe it doesn't bother them. But those are the kinds of questions I really want answered. So I think that the twofold misconception I would say is one, that we know the answers to a lot of these things. Oh yeah, surely science has tackled that. Nope. No idea about a lot of them. And then the other is just that an ecosystem can be healthy, and the animals in it, the majority possibly of animals in it, could still be having a really bad time.
Right. I think that's a really interesting one. Thank you for that. Yeah, I think we often talk and act as if what's best for the ecosystem is also what's best for the individual animals living within it. And it seems to me that that's not necessarily the case at all. An example that I think vegan listeners might be sympathetic to is to think about think about how we often talk as if a species is stable and there's lots of them, then they're doing well. But if we put this in the context of, say, farmed animals, like factory farmed chickens, well, there's lots of them. From a species level, perhaps you could say that they're being really successful. But if you look at the individual animals, their well-being, how they're doing, well, they're not doing very well at all. It's certainly not something we would even want to conserve, for example. It's something that we understand that the well-being of the animals matters, needs to be taken into consideration. And perhaps when we shift that over to looking into at the natural world, we maybe don't quite see that perspective of the individual when we think at the level of the species or the ecosystem. Do you have any thoughts on that, Bill, at all?
I do. I think you're right about that. And I think Michelle's right. These are very important questions. I think the two things the misunderstandings that I experience when I'm doing my talks or trainings or classes is that nature is red in tooth and claw and it's nothing but pain, suffering, death, or it's an idyllic place. And you don't have to think very, very deeply about these issues. And I don't think it's either. And I think it's really mixed, and it depends on the context and the creatures and when they're born and what they are and, what they have available to them and the quality of their lives. And like Michelle said, this is an important piece to be thinking through. There's a follow-on question, though. Once we have the information about whether the amount and degree of suffering, as well as non-suffering, what do we do about it then? And I think that becomes more problematic. We haven't done a very good job of intervening in the world to date. And I don't think we have much prospect of doing much better into at least the near future. We're going to need to know a lot more. And Michelle is, working on that. But we're also going to need to be much more morally mature. I should say, though, that I'd love to have you talk to some of our other folks who specialize in wild animal well-being. I'm not an expert in that area. I do know that there are species that have very high quality lives in the wild, at least so I'm told. And I think that's something that we should explore as well, because it's not always just about suffering. It's also that other side of well-being, and we have to hold those in tension and bring them into dialogue.
Absolutely, that's a good point. Doesn't have to all be doom and gloom. Perhaps Michelle can correct me if I'm wrong here, but I've heard that as a general rule of thumb, larger animals who have fewer offspring, we have reason to believe that they may experience better welfare. So like elephants, for example, because they actually get looked after by their parents, whereas the reproductive strategy that Michelle was talking about earlier, about having lots of babies, and like it's kind of, you put enough out that the one or two will survive. That's the kind of the strategy. As far as I'm aware, is that the most common strategy in wild animals? Michelle, am I right about that?
It depends on how you define most common, possibly. I mean, I think
it's a spectrum, isn't it?
And the thing is, it's not like people are used to hearing this term R and K selection. Some people might be familiar with, and it's not like there's this bin called R selected and tons of species just fit in that bin, and then this bin called K selected and they fit. It is a spectrum, and so animals will fall in different points. I think, to Bill's point, I do think some people hear this point I'm making about the misconception, and then only want to talk about the suffering or immediately assume that suffering dominates in nature. And I think if you have this view that suffering dominates in nature, it becomes very hard to justify a conservation mindset, because it's like, why do you want to preserve this thing that's causing more harm than good? And I think we just have nowhere near enough data to even know that question, and haven't sat with it as a philosophical perspective long enough to be like very confident about what to do about it. And which is why Wild Animal should focus so much on promoting research. And one of the reasons I say that is that even though it is true that many different species have far more offspring than live to adulthood, we truly don't know that much about what these animals actually experience. So we have an a priori case for why we think a lot of those animals who don't survive to adulthood are having a really bad time. But without the evidence to back it up, like, I'm not ready to do anything about that until I learn a lot more, because we don't know how much psychological processes differ between species in terms of affective state. We find exceptions to rules, like I'm forgetting the specific invertebrate, but there's a very small bug of some kind that actually invests in parental care, and like many people assume that all insect type animals don't do any of that, and just a variety, so many uncertainties that I feel like it's really premature to have a final, I think someone can say like, oh, well, I feel really strongly that like the case is like, it must be the case that more animals are suffering than benefiting from nature. And I'm sympathetic to the intuitions that lead someone to feel that way. But I think it really begs for examination.
Sure. I completely agree that we need to acknowledge uncertainty. I suppose like some assumptions that I have that just lead me to the conclusion that it's highly likely that there's, a hell of a lot of suffering in nature. I mean, just the sheer amount of animals, we have reason to believe there's lots of them. A lot of animals, we have reason to believe they can suffer, even if you don't include insects. Like we're sure that some of them probably can suffer. And the fact that we have theoretical reasons why it seems that most of them are dying, and dying can often hurt. So I guess it's kind of this like intuitive argument that we can build why, that we know we have some theoretical reasons why it could be quite bad, I suppose.
Yeah. I think the follow-up, though, to what you do about that, like another thing we're really uncertain about is how easy it is to help to change those circumstances. Like, a lot of stuff that people contemplate when they hit along this idea of nature having more suffering in it than goodness, say, are irreversible actions or nearly irreversible actions. And what you don't want to do is kind of throw the baby out with the bathwater. I mean, I know there are some ethical perspectives that are incredibly suffering focused and only focus on the reducing of suffering. And that's not an ethical position that I hold. I do think addressing suffering is really important, but I don't think it's the only thing. So I wouldn't reduce all of Earth to nothing to avoid suffering. I want to preserve some of the well-being that does exist here. And as Bill points out, we know there is well-being. I think the majority of animals who live to adulthood, I think, probably have lives worth living. They get pleasure from their experiences, most likely. The same way we get pleasure from eating and doing what our bodies were made to do a lot of the time. I think animals get that pleasure as well. And so I think I really want to understand, okay, even if it is the case that more animals are suffering than doing well, one option is to try to stop the suffering, but another answer is try to change the suffering into well-being or into positive welfare. And figuring out how easy that is to do when nobody's tried it before is like, it would be premature to conclude it's not doable, or that it's even like, oh, it would take so long, it's not worth trying. It's like, nobody knows.
Yeah, because one thing I often hear is that humans will inevitably make things worse. Ecosystems are complex. We shouldn't go in there and make things worse. Humans always make things worse. But as you said, I guess we haven't really intervened with the explicit intention of making things better. So it does. While we can acknowledge that we need far more research in this area, I suppose it does seem premature to conclude that there's no way we can ever make things better.
Well, I'll jump in on that one. I've rung this bell twice, and I'll ring it a third time. Where humans are, Isaiah Berlin talks about humans as being crooked timbers, and Mary Midgley talks of us as moral primates. Part of our evolutionary heritage is as a sort of a tribal species, a primate tribal species that has developed modes of cooperation, reciprocity, and care. So we can act with great ethical intent and do real good in the world. But at the same time, our evolutionary heritage as a primate tribes can make us very competitive, very destructive. And so once again, we need a lot of knowledge, which is what Michelle is looking at, but we need a whole bunch of moral growth to be sure that we're not imposing some sort of idealized notion of our own on other animals and the rest of nature, or not using the justification of going in and doing good for self-interested purposes.
I think that's a good point. Yeah, I agree. And do you also hold this same view, though, when it comes to types of interventions that we currently are doing, things like conservation and rewilding? Absolutely. So when I said that conservation is really a species with many, with many different kinds of animals within it, there's the traditional view of conservation,
which does have a very instrumentalizing approach to animals and a manipulative approach. And then there's new paradigms of conservation arising, one of which is called compassionate conservation. And we have a lot of expertise in our think tank about compassionate conservation. And in that, while there is this attempt to honor and protect the natural world, it's always being done with a concern for the individual animals who constitute that world and matter in and of themselves. So it's this ethics-informed approach to conservation that is very wary of not just lethal management, but harmful management. In fact, many compassionate conservationists would say lethal management is off the table. We should be doing management that improves the well-being of animals. And if we can't do that, we should step aside, let them work it out, because our direct inventions have not always been very helpful.
Mm-hmm. I briefly mentioned rewilding there, and I think it'd be kind of interesting to go on to that. But again, being the definition guy, perhaps, Bill, you could tell us what exactly is it?
Rewilding is just like ecology in the sense that both of them have a science side and an ethics side. The science side of rewilding is what you might call nature-led conservation or nature-led protection. And that's the idea that it's wrapped up in what are called the 3 C's, that you need cores of relatively undisturbed nature. Doesn't mean it's never been disturbed, but it's got to have ecological health to it. It's got to be a functioning ecosystem. You need corridors between these various areas so that plants and animals can move through those corridors and engage in reproductive activities, predatory activities, and exchange of genetic materials, etc. And you need carnivores. Because it turns out that carnivores are one of the major drivers of biodiversity in ecosystems. So that's called the 3 C's. And so if you put those 3 things together, cores, corridors, and carnivores together, and it's a relatively healthy landscape, you preserve a lot of biodiversity, as opposed to just walling things off in, like, let's say, a zoo or a wilderness that doesn't have the carnivores, or doesn't have the ability of carnivores to cross its boundaries, to refresh their genetic heritage, to maintain their vitality. If you think about the plight of the Florida panther, which is suffering basically inbreeding, genetic depression, because its various populations were cut off and then exterminated. So there was only one small remnant population. That would be a good example of this. The problem with that, but that's just the science side. The ethics side is rewilding arose back in the 1990s because people were concerned about the well-being of wild animals in the world. And they wanted enough space and habitat for those creatures to be able to live their own autonomous lives and be respected for who they are. In other words, a recognition of their intrinsic value. So rewilding has both of those dimensions, and it comes together in what's called the 4 C's, which are the cores, the corridors, the carnivores, but also compassion for the well-being of those individuals, especially when you're in the process of rewilding. If you're introducing predators into a landscape where ungulates, maybe there's an overpopulation of ungulates, but now they're going to be hunted, that's an introduction of harm and suffering that it may be justified, but it cannot be just, those concerns cannot be dismissed. You have to take those concerns up and try and figure out how to most compassionately engage in rewilding.
Mm-hmm. Michelle, I'm wondering how you feel about rewilding from a purely wild animal welfare perspective. Do you have any thoughts about this?
Yeah, I think, we would agree definitely with the last bit that, you have to be conscious of the harm caused by any change that you do. It's just that's kind of almost the entire conversation if you're taking a wild animal welfare perspective. So let's say you have an island to like maybe slightly reduce the complicated knock-on effects of any project in nature. Let's say you have an island and it, somehow only had 3 species on it. Some plant that fed an herbivore that fed a carnivore. And, 1,000 years ago, the carnivore went extinct, or 100 years ago. Let's not make it too complicated. The carnivore went extinct, and now you're deciding whether to reintroduce that carnivore. I don't know. That's not exactly a rewilding project because it doesn't have all the C's. And it's a little bit of a simple case. But like to decide whether you should do that or not, I think the typical wild animal welfare person would try to add up the current well-being in the system, the current welfare in the system, which maybe if you were really doing it really simplistically, you would just say like the number of individuals coming into existence year over year and kind of score their experience and kind of multiply that together. I don't know. Obviously, we need to improve our ability to assess what that is. But let's say you had a good assessment system that you were happy with, and you said, I can assess that welfare score of the individuals living there now. And then you do a really careful model to say this is what the welfare score of all the animals, including the animals you introduce. So now there's some extra carnivores, and let's say they're having a good life. They add some positive welfare to the ecosystem. And you have some deer, and some of the deer are now killed by wolves, and they weren't before. And so they're a negative. That's a negative on your scorecard. But you also have many animals who are not competing as closely for resources, who now have better lives. And so it's maybe a mixed answer there. So you would want to try to compare before and after. To the best of your knowledge, is introducing the wolves going to do more good in terms of the well-being of all the individuals living there than harm? But then you have to also pair this with the question of, is that the only option I have? If you're considering introducing wolves, could you also introduce a fertility control, intervention or something like that? Or could you implement a different program to improve the welfare of the deer without needing any deer to be eaten? What are the costs of that? Because, a fertility control program, that's going to be expensive. Is it going to be taken up year after year? If one government does it, but then someone else gets elected, is it going to be canceled? It becomes incredibly complicated, but in theory, you would want to think about all the options you have for action and choose the one that leads to the most positive outcome for all the animals involved. I totally acknowledge that is so hard to do. But I think in principle, that's what many wild animal welfare advocates would want to try to do to answer the question of like, should you undertake a project to reintroduce a species or change this ecosystem in a way that would match what a rewilding advocate would want to do in that ecosystem.
Right, like a purely wild animal welfare perspective wouldn't include like placing an importance on the natural space being undisturbed by humans, or place value on biodiversity, or only insofar as it affects the well-being of the animals, right? Those two things wouldn't be there.
Certainly we have plenty of evidence that human presence causes stress to wild animals. So it's absolutely going to be a negative on the scorecard in a lot of situations if you're saying we're going to keep human interference in this ecosystem or something like that. But it's just, but if you do that, how does that compare to other options that you have? And so, trying to think kind of counterfactually, comparing that option to other things, it's not a negative just because humans are present in that ecosystem. It's a negative in virtue of the influence those humans have. And if somehow those humans are having more of a positive influence than a negative one, then we would welcome their presence in that nature.
Right, yeah. When it comes to trophic rewilding, introducing, say, wolves to hunt and kill deer, from my perspective, I've always felt like this was cruel. Like intuitively, like I can't, like it really, it's something that bothered me as a child, actually, watching David Attenborough documentaries. So when Michelle mentions things like, well, we could look at perhaps fertility control. Of course, we need far more research on all of this. But that being said, Bill, how do you feel about that? Do you think that perhaps there could be more compassionate options to control the population of, say, deer, rather than introducing other animals to eat them?
I'll go back to the humility argument. Yes, I think these options should be on the table. And I think what you're hearing Michelle and I articulate are different emphases and not oppositional perspectives, although there are people in the conservation and animal communities who do have very oppositional perspectives, but I don't think you're hearing that here. I think what conservationists would say is that nature's taken a long, long time to figure out what works. there's a kind of a storehouse of knowledge there. And we have to be humble about that, recognize that storehouse of knowledge, and be willing to work with that. Now, that may mean that sometimes we engage in interventions, but at least we have to give nature its due. The Socratics have and I must admit this has been a big influence on my own ethics, have a phrase called follow nature. And they don't mean by that anything that happens in nature is good. It's more that sort of pay attention empirically to what's occurring, honor natural processes, learn from them, perhaps design as those natural processes work. So you mimic nature. There's a whole field called biomimicry, which is really, really important in questions of sustainability. There is a degree of cruelty. You're absolutely right, introducing carnivores. But at the same time, from my perspective, I don't see predation as being a problem per se. I follow what's called the principle of predation, that it's a natural fact and it's a moral good in the world, but it's not without harm. So it performs what I call a sad good. So when the wolf eats the deer, you're talking about two sentient, sapient creatures, one who is being killed or is being killed and eaten. That's sad. But it's good for the deer, it's good for the wolves, it's good for the community of life, because it helps moderate the populations of deer. You don't have deer over browsing, starving, failing, sort of their well-being diminished and then more subjected to disease. And we have, to emphasize the practical, we have actual evidence of this through the reintroduction of wolves in the Northern Rockies, in Yellowstone National Park, and the recovery of wolves in sections of Europe and Canada. So we see this, but once again, you have to, when I say sad good, I'm recognizing that I'm thinking about the well-being of individuals, different kinds of animal individuals, as well as the community in which they exist. And I'm balancing those things together. If I was only thinking about the well-being of individual animals, then I might not be willing to make that kind of argument.
Cool. Matt, you said a lot of interesting things there that I'd love to talk about. I tried to make some notes as going along. I hope I can touch on the important things. And Michelle, feel free to jump in if you have something you want to say. I suppose when people talk about like nature having a knowledge that's kind of built up over time, I guess I take issue with that, because I think there's so much personification of nature. We talk about Mother Nature as if it's got goals, as if it looks after these animals, when really what we're talking about here is natural selection, I suppose. And natural selection optimizes for the replication of genes, not for the well-being of animals. These two things, I suppose, aren't remotely the same thing. So I don't think we have a reason to believe that the way things happen to be in nature also happen to be what's best for the animals that live within it. Also, interesting that you say you see predation as a moral good. I've never heard that before, and I suppose that seems really, really counterintuitive to me, and a little bit crazy. Sorry, just trying to be radically honest. You said
not the only one who's told me that.
I'm used to get people saying that I'm crazy when I talk about wild animal welfare, so I'm just it's rubbing off on me, I guess. But you said it's like a natural fact. I mean, I agree that it's a natural thing. Animals being eaten alive is natural, and cancer can be seen as natural. There's lots of things that are natural that certainly aren't good, and I would put predation as one of them. You mentioned Yellowstone. I suppose from the perspective of wild animal welfare, we don't know whether what they did at Yellowstone was good or bad from the perspective of the individual animals living within it. We don't know if there's more or less suffering as a result of that intervention. I think we may have reason to believe that there might be more because of the increased biodiversity, increased smaller animals and as such. But I know I've said a hell of a lot there. We can reply to any of that. Michelle can come in. I'm particularly interested in talking about the predation thing being a good, because to me that's, like I said, that's very counterintuitive.
Sure. Well, I don't want to talk too much. Michelle, did you want to jump in?
There's so much here. I do want to say that I think predation is one of the most difficult topics to cover. It's definitely the thorniest we cover at Wild Animal Initiative, and it's maybe like one of the most kind of butting heads type of point for people who value just animal affective experiences versus people who value, you know, something in addition to that about the natural world. So I do think there's lots of room for, and it's also like, even if nature doesn't optimize for well-being, that it does, its history has led to an understanding of what can be maintained stably. And I don't want to undersell the value of things that are self-sustaining, because a project that does good but requires constant input of energy to maintain is not one that we can have much confidence in lasting through to the future. And that's always going to be a difficulty of human efforts to modify nature in a way that doesn't understand nature. So I think that's one place of strong overlap, I would say, between my perspective and Bill's, is that absolutely we cannot get overconfident, and absolutely we need to learn things from nature, because we're only going to find sustainable activities for wild animal benefit by pushing natural states into other states that are stable. And not, you know, we can do short-term things that help us learn a lot. You know, I'm an advocate right now at Wild Animal Initiative for fertility control for pigeons in urban environments where they're often being bothered or killed. That's not a self-sustaining intervention, but it is something I advocate for because I think it has a lot of good in the short term and builds up our knowledge. But in the long run, we need to be aiming for these kinds of self-sustaining systems, and we can learn a lot from nature about what can be self-sustaining. But yeah, I'm happy to go back to the question of why is predation good? I just for anyone listening to this, I think if we focus on this too much, you end up coming away with the sense of like, oh, there's so much distance between these communities. And I think that even if everyone tomorrow woke up and said, wow, we really need to do something about the problem of predation, it would be thousands of years before we even had any, you know, we were actually able to implement that in a way that we were really, really confident would be good for a variety of reasons. So.
Sure, but I agree. But I suppose what we may be doing now is actually causing more predation, which is another question, I suppose. So we certainly, it's not colloquially known that predation is good, but we are, for conservationist reasons perhaps, causing more animals to be eaten alive. But yeah, Bill, if you want to delve more into why you see predation as a moral good, that might be interesting.
Well, the moral good has to do with, and let's actually go back to natural fact. I'm not sure that I agree, and I'm not an expert on this, but I'm not sure I agree that evolution simply optimizes for genetic selection. That certainly is a Dawkins-like argument, the selfish gene. But it turns out that genetic expressions and epigenetic effects are far more common and far more variable than just the optimization for certain sort of genetic selection. Plus, in some ways that's not the only thing that matters, because even though I'm the product in some senses of my genes, I'm still a center of experience. I'm interacting with others and I'm having impacts on them. So I want to be careful about talking about nature as just or evolution as just optimizing for genes. And I think when we say that, you know, it has a wealth of knowledge, where it doesn't have a consciousness, there's no Gaia talking to us, but we can, through scientific understandings, gain knowledge from its various phenomena and interactions. That's what's really meant in that regard. And that, for the reasons that Michelle was talking about, that can be very, very important, hence biomimicry, for example. In terms of predation itself, there are multiple well-beings to be thought about here. There's the well-being of the herbivore, there's the well-being of the carnivore, there's the well-being of the ecological communities and social communities on which they both partake. Predation produces a sad good. It's sad for those who are predated upon. It's good for those who are the predators, as well as for the larger ecological and social community. And we are pretty certain that that's true in Yellowstone because you have much healthier elk herds. The elk that are eaten by wolves are not entirely consumed by wolves. They're often eaten by smaller, they're scavenged by smaller animals. They're eventually broken down by detrivores, those small microorganisms and bugs and things that turn them back down into those nutrients. Those nutrients go back into the ecosystem to be taken up by other living beings. It's part of this cycle of life. And it's in how we feed. It's driven by energy from the sun, and you lose the energy. That's why you need to have the sun keep on going. But there's this material cycle going on. This is part of the engine of life, the cycle of life. And without it, you're talking about having to completely rewire, or as some other Johansson says, edit nature. He wants to do that genetically. There's no way we have the wisdom or moral maturity to do that. At least in my perspective, and I think my perspective would be shared by many conservationists.
Mm-hmm. I suppose I would agree that, like, right now, I suppose we simply haven't got anywhere near enough research to start trying to make large scale changes, in ecosystems and that kind of thing. Because I mean, it hasn't really been something we've been trying to do. I mean, Michelle, how long has Wild Animal Initiative been around? It's probably been like since
2017, yeah.
Right. Yeah. So I suppose the first things first, we need like a hell of a lot of research, finding out what might be possible, what are the experiences of wild animals. I guess I kind of find it hard to believe that like the optimal state for the individuals living in nature would include being eaten alive. You know, if I was God, which I wish I was,
it's a bad design. If you were God, it's a bad design.
I certainly would not. If I wanted to create my dream world, it would not include baby animals being eaten alive. And I understand that you could say it's like good for the wolves because they'll starve if they don't eat animals. But I suppose what we may be talking about when it comes to rewilding is creating more wolves. Introducing these interests, these desires that perhaps wouldn't have been there otherwise. And of course, we could have questions about the intensity of the suffering of being eaten. Perhaps I disvalue that more than I would value like the pleasure that the wolf would get from eating them, that kind of thing. So,
but notice the presuppositions in what you're saying. I'm not saying you're wrong. The questions you're raising are important questions, and you have to meet them both ethically and scientifically. But you're presupposing that it's those individuals who matter most, and not the communities and larger ecological and social communities that also matter as well. You're also presupposing that suffering is sort of a measure of wrongfulness. And there are ethical ways of thinking about the world that don't prioritize suffering in them. I'm not saying you're wrong. I think you're bringing an important perspective to the table that needs to be heard, just like Michelle is. I'm just saying that there are many others who think of predation as being a positive good, as suffering as being a natural fact. And it's better for us to make interventions in terms that don't deny the natural processes in the natural world or take away the choices and integrity of wild animal lives themselves, including predators. And that would involve a lot of, in my view, changing our behavior towards animals in terms of rewilding to give them space to what they need to do, as well as providing aid to wild animals where we can, and not take away from their autonomy, their integrity, or the integrity of the natural world.
Right.
Disaster relief, wildlife rehabilitation, medical interventions for diseases that don't have fundamental ecological purposes. I mean, we've got 40% of deer in the United States are now infected with COVID-19. So you have a reservoir of COVID-19 in deer that may evolve into another variety. That could be very harmful for the deer and for ourselves. We should be doing something about that. And it seems to me that's a real practical intervention that improves everybody's well-being.
Just to clarify on my perspective here, it's not that I value the well-being of the deer more than I value the well-being of the wolf. I'm an anti-speciesist, and I think that all suffering matters equally, as long as the suffering is equal. And I agree that suffering is like a natural thing. I suppose I don't necessarily think that what's natural is something good or to be preserved. I mean, I suppose we could imagine that hell exists. Let's say hell exists. You could also assume that it was a natural thing. I certainly don't think it's something that we would want to conserve. I would like us to intervene unnaturally and get rid of hell for sure. And I understand what you're saying about animals having their autonomy and freedom. And I would care about it as well, insofar as it affects their well-being. What I would say is that it's interesting talking about animals having their choices and their freedom, because you could make an argument that the wolf who's eating them alive is taking away their choice and their freedom as well. And then someone, I suppose, could make the argument that, well, the wolf hasn't got the moral agency we have, but then we have some psychopaths or some humans who also don't have that moral agency, and we wouldn't say it's okay for them. We wouldn't let them harm innocent children, for example, who are similar sentience and sapience to wild animals. Sorry, I'm just harping on there, so I'll let Michelle say whatever you wanted to say.
Yeah, well, I think, Jack, I'm very sympathetic to your position. Obviously, we have very shared moral values. I think at the end of the day, though, like the practical place I land is often much closer to Bill's position, in part because of the deep scientific uncertainty we have. Like you were just saying about Yellowstone, you were saying like a reasonable hypothesis might be that because restoring the wolves to Yellowstone had increased the biodiversity of that habitat, the number of individuals coming into existence and dying very shortly thereafter had increased, and that probably far outweighed any positives it did. Like, let's say that's one hypothesis you might have about what happened there. I'm really not sure. Like, it presupposes, first of all, that like the welfare, I find it a deep moral question. If I come into existence for 3 days and then die pretty quickly on the 4th day, is that really bad? I don't know the answer to that. Like, I think many people have a strong intuitive sense. I was speaking to someone, I read someone's article the other day, and they were saying that I would need to live at least 3 years for the badness of death to be worth it. Where did they get that number? Like, that was personal to them, but like, how do we know how that, if they're like, okay, so I'm going to use that metric and assume that's the same for everyone else, and then say this is like where we're at. That number came from nowhere. That number came out of a guess in that person's brain, So I think it's really important that we actually recognize the assumptions that go into these hypotheses and then question them empirically. And so if I was to make the best wild animal welfare case for reintroducing wolves to Yellowstone, it would be to look at to say we're really uncertain about what the welfare value of animals who die very young actually is. In fact, just as a plug, Wild Animal Initiative is funding a call for proposals right now on juvenile well-being, because we really want to learn more about this. But, if we say that we're pretty uncertain about that, and then we have all these deer who are dying over, of less violent deaths, but over longer periods of time because they're starving gradually from resource competition, or they're packed together so they're having high rates of disease. And we look at, over time, the average quality of life of those deer being very low before the wolves were reintroduced, and then actually going up. So you now have some animals dying from a kind of extreme form of death, which is being eaten. And again, probably different ways of killing have different suffering values, so I would want to know a lot more about how a wolf pack kills and how much suffering that imparts on the deer and how much the deer actually feel. Maybe the elk, it's probably elk over there, but how much, maybe their adrenaline is so high that they actually don't have too much of a bad experience during that. I don't know. And then just carrying that through, okay, that deer dies, and now because of the decreased deer population, the quality of all the forage is better. You have to make a pretty, and so now more animals of like many different species are now supported by those plants. And I totally agree that if you're very, very, very certain that all animals that have lots of offspring, their young definitely have lives just full of suffering, that, that all that support for more animals doesn't outweigh that. But I just don't think anyone should have that strong and empirical assumption at this stage. And so that being said, I think the wild animal welfare conclusion on Yellowstone should be like, we need more research.
Yeah, I totally understand that. And there's a whole lot of uncertainty here. And I suppose like the issue of the deer starving and dying from disease because there's no population control, I suppose I would say like that is a problem. And that needs to be dealt with because it's harming their well-being. And I just find it unlikely that the optimal solution would be to cause them to be eaten alive. And I understand I'm making a bunch of assumptions here. Like I have the assumption that being eaten alive is probably some of the most intense experiences for wild animals and terrible, like unbearable suffering. So I think we'd have to, we're setting the bar so high for like we don't want to intervene to try and make things better unless we're sure that we're going to make things better. But then we're intervening in a way that's causing some very, very intense, terrible experiences. And we still have that uncertainty. We have the uncertainty that we're,
Yeah. You're not going to get an argument from me that we should hold off on rewilding until we know a lot more. I also agree with that. It's just that I would not. I'm more at and unfortunately,
sorry,
even
you're not going to get an argument from me that we'll hold off on rewilding.
No, that we should. We should.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. My perspective would be we should neither rewild nor throw out rewilding until we have a lot more data. And I think it goes back to that question of the services that predators do provide to an ecosystem. If it was just a matter of population control as the only mechanism by which predators cause these massive changes in ecosystems that lead to all these things we don't understand, I would say like, okay, we definitely don't need that because we can always just send hunters in to shoot the deer to keep the populations down. Like if that's the only mechanism, let's just train some people and they'll shoot the deer, but and hopefully under the assumption that getting shot is a less painful way to go than being eaten by a wolf. But I still think you have all this uncertainty because we don't fully understand all of what's going on with, and maybe other people probably understand it better than I do, but I doubt we're at 100% knowledge about all the services maybe not services, but all the actions that are caused by having a carnivore in an ecosystem. What we know is that it's big. It's a big effect. And so I think that then at this stage, it would really be hubristic to conclude that humans can replace all those effects or pick and choose the good effects and the bad effects and only have the good ones without a lot more research. That being said, I am very conscious of this inaction-action distinction. Like, while we're not acting, we're allowing things to continue as they are, and if things as they are turn out to be very bad, that's very unfortunate. And I do feel that very deeply, and I care a lot about it, which puts a lot of urgency on my desire to do research. But I think even if I personally don't think it's worse to cause harm as to fail to prevent harm, that's a prevailing social norm that I have to work under. And so I think with that in mind, I really try to, I have to just emphasize the value of research again and try to encourage people who care about this to when they're talking to other people, to acknowledge the degree of additional learning that is needed, rather than coming out with really strong statements about, well, here's this perspective and this is what it means for our actions in nature. So like, definitely this.
For me, one of the lessons here is that while we may disagree about this, we're talking about it. And we're talking about it as people who may have different perspectives, but who fundamentally care deeply about the well-being of wildlife. And it's this kind of conversation, whatever our differences, that needs to be pulled out of the sort of animal community space and inserted in the conservation community space. That's what compassionate conservation and rewilding are doing to some degree, so that we talk about these issues and we start to think and act on the basis of these issues.
Yeah, I definitely think in the spectrum of views that is out there, the people who care really deeply about wild animal lives need to get together, because there's so many people who don't care about that at all. And even if we have different perspectives about what it would mean to do that, I think there's enough it's not like we're so diametrically opposed about how to do that there aren't shared projects we can all agree are really valuable. And even just compromises. I mean, some conservationists undertake these massive invasive animal eradications, for example. And they're not valuing the experiences of the animals they're killing. They're saying that the biodiversity good that is accrued from eliminating rats from this island in the Galapagos is going to be greater than, is more important than the extremely painful death by rodenticide that those animals would experience. And, you know, I think even if we're not going to say you shouldn't do that project of eradication, if we can come along with the technology to do that in a more humane way, for example, by using a fertility-focused method to reduce that population instead of lethal control via rodenticide, that's millions of rats who are going to experience much less suffering. Even if ultimately it's in service of a conservation goal, that's something that we can accomplish that's a little more closer to hand.
Yes. Remember at the very beginning, I said context was really important for thinking through these issues. And what Michelle just brought up, it speaks to that directly. There's a huge hue and cry, what we call a moral panic over cats and biodiversity. And what happens in the conservation community, despite saying they care and love about their cats, they're willing to kill cats, remove cats from the landscape by any means necessary. And that means hunting, trapping, and poisoning. Without any attention to the context in which cats really are a problem, the context where they're not, and then the follow-on question that even if they are a problem for biodiversity, how do we grapple with that? So, you know, there's Santa Clara Island had a large feral cat population that was preying upon its shore nesting seabirds. They removed those cats and put them in a sanctuary instead of sending in sharpshooters to kill those cats. There may be times where cats are absolutely have to be killed in order to save biodiversity, but the need, and I'm open to that possibility. But the knee-jerk reaction that something is an immigrant species that wasn't there before, therefore they have disvalue in the community, and killing them is the way to get rid of them is deeply problematic. And it's conversations like the ones we're having, various perspectives on animal ethics, whether it's out of the vegan world or out of Mary Midgley's mixed community world or other worlds, that really need to be brought to the table to talk about these issues, because invasive species are another big piece of the puzzle when we're talking about wild animal suffering and the suffering that humans impose on other animals.
Absolutely, that's really well put. Thank you. And I really appreciate how you guys are saying, like, yeah, we have our differences and we can can come together and we can get stuff done. So I feel almost a little embarrassed with my next question because I really want to ask Bill this, and I probably won't be able to sleep if I don't ask it. So I'm going to ask it anyway. But like, say, let's imagine, this is hypothetical, so let's imagine there was like an indigenous tribe who were cut off from human civilization. We're talking about human beings. And let's say that previously they had been hunted by bears who killed some of the children or the weak humans. But they've hunted all those bears to extinction. So this population, this tribe is getting out of control. So it's causing harm to the biodiversity. Maybe it's causing some problems for humans in civilization, whatever. It's causing some damage to the health of the ecosystem, let's say. In that scenario, so if just basically was simply swapping the non-humans with the humans, would you ever be in favor of introducing bears, causing them to be eaten alive, or would that just be completely out of the question? Is there a difference between these scenarios?
There is a bear. Okay, I've been chased by a grizzly bear, and I'm lucky I came out alive.
And you were like, "This is such a good thing. This is such a moral good."
Well, I would be in favor of bear reintroduction, the restoration of bears as part of the community of life in some places, but not in other places. Once again, it depends on context. There's bear restoration, grizzly bear restoration going on right now in the Intermountain West of North America. There's eventually going to be polar bear restoration or something because of global climate change and the melting of the polar ice caps. There are places and peoples who've adapted well to bears and were able to avoid conflict with bears. There are other places that don't. I think, but to take your hypothetical, I think if you're talking about a primal people who have deep knowledge of their landscape and the creatures in their landscape, they're far less likely to have problems with bear restoration, practical problems with bear restoration, than city folks who know nothing about those bears and don't know how to manage those issues. I'm not saying there won't be conflicts, but I wouldn't have a problem with bear restoration, and I wouldn't have a problem if someone was harmed by a bear.
So you wouldn't have a problem if we introduced bears for the health of the ecosystem, and we knew it was going to result in some humans being eaten alive?
Well, part of the reason, let me put it like this. I don't value our lives any more than I value the lives of bears. Bears are critically threatened and endangered in some places. And that's been a consequences of our actions. So while bear predation on humans is infinitesimally small, you can't rule it out. But I think our moral obligation to the bears outweighs any possible hypothetical, theoretical harm that might come to humans. Now, if I knew that bear was going after that human, would I intervene to stop that? Absolutely. I don't want anybody in particular, any particular individual to be harmed. But as a theoretical notion that someone might get harmed sometime in the future, that's not it's a legitimate concern. It's not as persuasive to me as a kind of restorative justice for the bears who we have so harmed.
And Jack, I do want to highlight that even though that's not like possibly the wild animal welfare answer to the question, it's a calculation that our society makes all the time. Like, cars kill people way more than bears do. And we have just made a even not considering other animals in this question at all, just considering our human well-being, we have just accepted the at least 10,000 plus, maybe 100,000 plus. I don't know what order of magnitude it is, but many, many, many people die from car-related injuries every year, and we've accepted their deaths as a result of this other good.
Well, we do what we can to reduce the amount of deaths from car accidents. In the example with rewilding, trophic rewilding, what we're doing is we're purposely causing more of the suffering and death of animals to be eaten alive.
Yeah, but I think that's an action-in-action fallacy to some extent. Like, we are failing to act to stop cars from being a thing.
Well, no, we're trying to, though. We're trying to reduce the number of car accidents by having speed limits, using seatbelts, and
this gets to the false dichotomy you presented Bill with, though, because you presented him with a choice between introduce bears and they kill lots of people, or don't introduce bears and people run amok.
Oh, no. Because I guess in the wild animal example, there could be other.
Yeah, exactly.
Other
you
ways
could
in which we can help
reintroduce
as well.
You could reintroduce bears, but also introduce ways to keep them from hurting people if you wanted to.
Right, but Bill isn't in favour of introducing wolves but stopping them from eating the deer. He's in favour of introducing wolves also, and they eat the deer. So I think it's a fair hypothetical to give.
I mean, I agree with you to some extent. I mean, obviously, philosophically, I'm more in your camp. I think it's just interesting to look at how we make these same calculations in different contexts as a society, and often many of, I question the way we act towards cars, given how many people they kill every year. But many people do not. Many people just think that allowing this system to continue, because it has such a value on it of allowing us to transport ourselves efficiently and various things like that, it's just these deaths are just accepted. And I think it's interesting to compare that, even if I'm not saying that's a justification. I wouldn't say I would reintroduce the bears. I'm just saying that it's interesting to look at that comparison and the attitude that people take of we really love this good of having cars, but we're not going to say ban all cars until we figure out how cars cannot kill pedestrians, and then we'll reintroduce them. We're saying we're going to keep killing people until we figure out how to stop killing people, but we're just accepting that as a cost of doing business here. And I suppose it's kind of and I could be wrong, but I kind of see it as
a calculation based on well-being. Like, we feel like we're willing to accept the risk that, I'm willing to accept the risk that I might die in a traffic accident because of the benefits to society we get a hold of being able to travel in that way. But I take your point. I think it's a good one. And it's interesting to think about how we have these, we can put it in the human context. And perhaps, most of us don't really think about that. Cars, yeah. So, Bill, you also said that you would actually try and intervene if you saw a bear trying to predate on a human. So I'm interested then, if it was a non-human animal, a deer, would you have the same feelings? Would you try and intervene there in a specific case?
No, I wouldn't. Although I probably would feel like I wanted to, and I feel torn about that. Torn about that. I value predation deeply. I value predators deeply. It makes me uncomfortable seeing predation, and predation can be really horrific. I've seen some really terrible things. But my discomfort over how evolutionary ecology works is not enough for me to say, I want to intervene and change this. I think what I have to do is speaking for myself and my own moral perspective, is I have to look at the values, the full range of values that are being manifest in acts of predation. And it's not just the harm to individuals that matter. So much of this dialogue now I'm not saying with you, but so much of this dialogue with people I talk to comes down to them having an ultimate, they value their own lives absolutely, without measure and without any limitation. And they assume that's how we should think about other lives. So if we could say all life is sacred as a way of putting this in the shorthand vernacular, I don't think all life is sacred. I don't think my life is sacred. Please don't take this as a negative. I don't think your life is sacred. I don't think sacred has anything to do with this. I think rather we're all living beings trying to live amongst other living beings who are trying to live. And unfortunately, predation, in the sort of a biblical sense, predation is the dominant pattern, the feeding pattern, the world over. And unless you're willing to entirely rewire the world and have the knowledge and moral maturity to do that, I think it's better to accept predation, see its good sides, grapple honestly with its horrors, and do what we can about the harms that we do to animals and the natural world. I'm not going to intervene in the bear eating the deer. I don't know enough about the situation. I know the bear may have to eat the deer in order to survive. That deer may be old, that deer may be sick, because the deer's very fleet. If that bear catches that deer, that might have been a blessing for that deer. So it didn't starve. I just don't know. I don't have enough information in that regard. And I also have a trust that the natural dynamics of predation produce a natural good for individuals and for communities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, perhaps where we differ is I don't have that trust in natural processes, and but I appreciate your perspective. And perhaps where we can both agree, I think all of us can probably agree, is that if we're going to be acting in ways that, or if we're going to do rewilding, if we're going to cause more animals to be eaten alive and increase the number of animals being born, create all of this experience happening, this conscious experience, we certainly have to consider the well-being, consider those experiences when we're trying to decide whether this is something we should do.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. But notice, when you talk about introducing predators, you focus on the negative experiences. There's also lots of positive experiences. as well as positive outcomes from the reintroduction of predators. The experiences that those predators have themselves, the negative experiences that through acts of predation they save other creatures from, the well-being of the larger social and ecological communities of which they're a part. So once again, if you're thinking about weighing harms and benefits, and ethics, we call this harm-benefit ratios, it gets extremely complex in precisely the way that Michelle is talking about. So I don't think we can assume that introducing wolves is necessarily going to be a negative for those creatures.
I do want to emphasize here, though, that I think, Jack, one of the moral values you probably ascribe to, just guessing from your other material, is at least some form of utilitarianism that emphasizes a numerical view of positive and negative value in the world. And that's not common in society either. And that's something that we need to be conscious of as advocates for wild animal welfare, of like, if we can't make our story intelligible to the vast majority of people who do not have a utilitarian mindset, we're not going to be successful in actually getting anything done. And so I think one of the things that's kind of easy under a utilitarian view is that even if there's a significant benefit to the predators, a predator has to kill many individual prey. So there's always going to be a dominance of the prey experience over the predator experience, because it's not like a one-to-one. It's not like there's only one predator-prey interaction. It's a toss-up, whether that wolf matters or that deer matters. I agree, both the deer and the wolf matters, but the deer has to kill 10. The wolf has to kill 10 deer or something over its lifetime, and so that's actually, it makes it easier for the utilitarian to be more confident that the experiences of prey sort of are dominating the moral calculation. But I think there's many moral views under which things just don't, like, you can't just apply math to morals. Within the community Wild Animal Initiative operates in, it's very common to use math to like try to figure out your morals. But honestly, it's not common worldwide. It's the minority view. And then I think the other thing to know is that we don't have a way to do those additions yet. So what if it was the case that like it turned out that the best metric we could have of welfare is like dopamine or something like that, which I know is not the case. And we know a lot about the pleasure mechanisms in the brain that it's not like dopamine has a 1-to-1 ratio with how much pleasure you feel, but let's pretend it was for just convenience for a second. What if the like amount of dopamine was like in a wolf eating a prey was like 2 billion, and then the amount of like, I don't know, suffering molecule, let's say cortisol, let's pretend that it's not. Stress is not the same as suffering, but let's pretend for a second, just for convenience, was like only -10 for being eaten. Like, we don't actually know enough about benefit and cost in individual animals to even use the utilitarian mindset to be sure it's just one animal versus one prey, because we don't know how to quantify the amount of joy versus the amount of suffering either. And so I think it just becomes very much a deep scientific paired with ethical question of how, even if you want to take a numerical approach, which many people do not, whether you can do this, and whether comparing interspecies is possible, and whether what we're going to end up with is some kind of just ordinal metric. And so we have to be satisfied with things like, okay, here are these 5 domains of well-being. Let's talk about nutrition. Let's talk about behavior. Let's talk about feeding, like food. Did I say nutrition already? Oh my God. Okay, let's say there's like these 5 different domains of welfare. Normally I can say them all, but obviously not on the spot right now. But like, let's say you know that this one goes up, this one goes up, this one goes down, this one goes down, this one goes up, but you don't have numbers for them. And so you have to be, that could be the case of like what we get to in our empirical ability to assess welfare. And we might have to be satisfied with that. And then you might be able to compare things like, well, this kind of action leads to 5 ups, and this one leads to a mixture of ups and downs, so I'm gonna like go for the one that leads to all ups. But if you have 2 things that lead to some ups and some downs, we might end up being very uncertain about how to numerically compare those under like a sort of utilitarian framework of just adding up the goods and bads. And so we might need to be satisfied with something less than what we're hoping for in terms of the ability to make these assessments, and understanding how to do the work under that uncertainty is like the philosophical question to move forward with, I think.
Absolutely. I think you made a lot of really good points there. And And yeah, I mean, of course, a lot of uncertainty. I guess I just have this like high confidence that like being eaten is so terrible, so unbearable, that okay, we know, I know that, and that counts for something. If I was that animal being eaten alive, it would be the most important thing in the world, and I know that. That's kind of an assumption I have there. But absolutely, I don't know anything. I barely know anything.
I still think it's a morally praiseworthy assumption. It's about your caring about that individual wildlife, and that matters, and it's important in the conversation. While I might have this principle of predation that sees it as a moral good and a natural fact, I don't think that is in opposition to what you're saying. I think it perhaps complements, perhaps resonates with what it is that you're saying. And it's very complicated, and we need to continue talking about this stuff.
I feel like someone listening to this conversation so far, though, might think that most of what Wild Animal Initiative spends its time on is predation, and that's nearly none of what we spend our time on. So I'd love to talk about other areas of wild animal welfare and suffering that we're actually prioritizing for mainly practical reasons. I mean, I think in the case of vertebrates, we do know that in many taxa, predation is the primary cause of death. So if you're just going by urgency based on number of individuals affected, it's just how many animals are predated because they're suffering from a disease, or slowed down because of some infirmity is not actually understood. So I think, for practical reasons and for some other interesting empirical scientific reasons, we don't actually spend that much time at Wild Animal Initiative debating predation. Like, it's just not, it's not the most tractable question.
Yeah, it's not a tractable question. It's also difficult because you're talking about different kinds of beings with different possibilities, capacities, and likely possibilities for experience. So are we going to be concerned about birds eating insects? I think it's a legitimate ethical question to ask.
Oh, I do too.
But I'm not sure I'm going to put it at a high order. I mean, I think research on that is great. In terms of an action agenda item, it's not going to be something I'm going to worry about greatly. One, because that's a natural trophic process in which birds participate. The second reason is most of those insects, at least as best as we know, do not have deeply sophisticated long-term selves that we need to be worried about. Yeah. And this is like the krill versus baleen whale debate. They're all lives. We should care about them. We should think about them. But we're going to have to recognize there's a sort of a punctuated continua of consciousness, of experience, and that's going to affect our calculations of intrinsic value, instrumental value, what moral actions how we think about that, those interactions morally, and what actions we should take on that basis.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think from the sort of more wild animal welfare or utilitarian perspective, insects deserve a lot of consideration because of how uncertain we are about their mental capacities and then their number. Like, if you graphed the number of vertebrates against the number of invertebrates, you would barely see the vertebrate line, Not talking about numbers of, probably talking about numbers of species, invertebrates are very speciose, but just thinking about individual numbers of animals existing over time, like invertebrates dominate, So I think getting more clarity on this question of what are their affective capacities? Can they have deep suffering? Can they have joy? I honestly hope not, because that's just a big group of animals, we would not need to think about as deeply if they didn't. But if they do, then it does become more urgent. And that's why I think answering that question of what are their experiences is really important.
Could you tell us a little bit about what you are optimistic of in terms of how we might be able to help wild animals in the future?
Yeah, so I think one thing I'm really optimistic about is the ability to mitigate active harms caused by humans. I think that's the area where we tend to have the least unknowns, or the least complicated knock-on effects. So if we think about the amount of human eradication of what we call pests, where we could simply swap that method of lethal control of a population to a different probably fertility-based method of control. One could argue about whether we should be getting rid of pests, but assuming that activity is going to continue, we can at least continue it in a way that doesn't cause so much harm. I think that's something that's very possible. As an example, I'd love to highlight for people always the eradication of the screwworm in North and Central America. The screwworm is, and still exists in many parts of the world, a parasite. It preys on a variety of vertebrate species. I don't love that language because it's just another animal living its life, using other animals as resources, as many animals do, but that would be how it would be normally discussed. And the method of its parasitism could be quite painful. I read accounts of like monkeys falling out of trees with the screwworms coming out of their eyes. And it's obviously very painful. And I think I value, if the screwworm has experiences, I value them. But it turns out the method of population reduction maintains to some extent the screwworm. What they do is they have irradiated adult male screwworms, so they're infertile. And then they flood the ecosystem with these adult males at the border of wherever they've created this quarantine zone. So right now I believe it's in Panama, I'm not positive, but at that sort of point, they flood the region with that. So any screwworms coming up, any female screwworm adults, which I think it's a kind of fly, come up. And from South America, they mate with the sterile males. Because there's so many of the sterile males, they're more likely to encounter a sterile male than they are to encounter a fertile male. And so they don't produce any offspring. And so to maintain this border, these screwworms are raised in captivity, eating to their happiness. Hopefully the irradiation doesn't cause them suffering. Hopefully it's brief. If it is, it certainly doesn't kill them. And then they go out into the world and they mate, but they just don't produce any offspring. And then north of that border, there are no screwworms. And so for example, this has been beneficial for a particular conservation outcome. The endangered key deer, I believe, was a significant threat from extinction. I think at one point, many of their offspring were dying from screwworm infestations. And that eradication actually helped ensure that they thrived. But also just from a wild animal welfare perspective, individual animals no longer suffering from a very painful event caused by another animal is a good outcome, especially if you were able to achieve that without killing or torturing another animal. So that's a fertility-based method of control for that screwworm animal that led to good outcomes. It was accomplished because screwworms were a parasite on cattle, and cattle farmers banded together to say, we want them gone. So it wasn't done for wild animal welfare aims, but it may have had powerful wild animal welfare benefits. Of course, really hard to know. We're actually trying to fund someone to analyze after the fact what were all the consequences of this, because certainly more animals of a variety of species, juveniles, surviving to adulthood, if that's indeed what is happening, is important to know. Did a different species come in and is now occupying that niche? As far as we can tell, it has not. But that's something to look at. There's obviously more complicated questions, but that's the sort of thing where possibly it had a really good outcome. So I think that's another, besides just managing pests with a fertility-based control method instead of torturing them or killing them to get rid of a pest we don't like, that seems good as a possible benefit to that pest species itself. But then if we identify more if we identify more animals that are causing significant harm to other animals, where we can have a reasonable confidence about what the outcome of an action is going to be and not deeply harm that animal who's causing harm to other animals in order to achieve that seems like the kind of thing where, especially where it's not viewed as predation, which people view very differently than parasitism for some reason. But people are more willing to get rid of parasites. So I feel like, especially if there's a parasite that harms both humans and animals, that might be something where we're able to have an impact. And then more broadly, just disease. I think rabies, for example, causes a lot of animals a lot of harm. When you're talking about a virus, for example, the virus, as far as we understand it, is sort of at the borderline of being alive even. So it probably doesn't have sentient experiences we need to worry about. And, if that's the case, then it's very easy to advocate for eradicating a disease and then just keeping track of what happens. If a population was mainly controlled by that disease and now it's exploding, we need to be ready to do something about that. But I think many people would be more comfortable moving forward on reducing a very painful disease from a wild population than some of these other ideas that have come up.
Great examples. Thank you very much. Yeah, and it's like an example that I suppose you're looking at things where the public are happy to get behind, unlike what I've been talking about for the last hour, which is predation. Sorry about that. Yeah, and like you said, I suppose eradicating the screwworms, eradicating rabies in Europe, this was done for human-centric reasons, I suppose, but it seemed to perhaps have a positive effect for the well-being of animals, which makes me really excited, by the way, guys. Like, if we can help animals without even trying to help them, I mean, how much good are we going to do when we actually try?
Sure. And of course, you've got to look at what are all the other things humans have done in Europe and what have the impacts on animals been. But, yeah, definitely. I mean, if rabies is, probably one where for most populations, it was not having, a population damage, down, what is the word I'm looking for? Depressing effect. It probably was sort of... Actually, I'm not going to speak on that because I'm not a disease ecologist and I could be wrong. But, if you have a disease where removing that disease doesn't lead to these really wild, complex effects where now the animal that was having that disease is now starving to death, and you have to think about the trade-off between having a disease and starving to death. If you have a disease where it's treating that is relatively simple, or especially in a population, if it's focuses on a population like elephants where they don't reproduce that productively, and so it's unlikely that changing a disease dynamic would have this massive runaway effect on the likelihood that they starve to death or something like that. Those are going to be ones where we can be much more confident about what the outcomes of our actions are, and so those are going to be easier to implement. In the long run, I hope we get the artificial intelligence and make beautiful models that come and tell us how the things we do in nature will behave. But, barring godlike knowledge of our actions in nature, we've got to be really careful.
Cool. And Bill, do you think there's going to be lots of potential ways in which conservationist goals can kind of work next to wild animal welfare goals, and we can kind of achieve both together?
Absolutely. The two examples of screwworms and rabies that Michelle was just talking about is important in that regard. I think it's parvovirus from dogs, European dogs introduced into Africa that got into lions is another good example of this. So there's especially around the issues of individual animal health and ecological health, there's lots of potential for good work together.
And I think another good thing to point to is just climate change. I think we have to be really, of course, we do not know, let's say there's a big period of climate change, but then we settle on a new stable equilibrium. A new stable equilibrium somewhere down the line. It's hard to know a priori whether that equilibrium would have a higher welfare content than our current state of affairs. But we can be pretty sure that in the intervening time, stuff's going to be hard. I think periods of massive global change where, yes, we have a sad situation now with the rabbit, say, where, many rabbits die so that a stable number can reach adulthood. But if that population starts declining, you have all the animals that were dying in the first place and additional animals now. So it's clearly that going through periods of massive change seem reasonably likely to be very bad, both from a conservation perspective and an animal well-being perspective. And so, I think even if you thought where we were going to land at the end of climate change was going to be better than where we are now, there must be a better way of getting there than massive global climate change. So I think that's another one where it's interesting to look at and think about where there might be some area of overlap. That one's more complicated. Obviously, talking about global change, does not have any of the features that I was describing before of simple, where you can be reasonably certain about what the effects of your actions will be. But from an intellectual point of view, it's very interesting, and I think there may well be some positive overlaps between conservation.
By the way, this is Cleo.
Hello, Cleo.
Otherwise known as Goddess Cleo. You rule the internet, don't you? Yeah. We could say the same thing about biodiversity loss, which is in part caught up with climate change, but is not just driven by climate change and didn't start to be lost by climate change. I mean, we're in the 6th great extinction. And so there's lots, and that extinction threatens ecological communities from a conservationist perspective, but and not just extinction, of loss of diversity, a loss of abundance, et cetera. It affects communities, ecological communities from that conservationist perspective, but it also affects the well-being of those individual animals. Yes, I know. Someone's hungry.
I'm sorry, your cat is so entertaining.
She is. She's wonderful, isn't she? She's amazing. But it also affects those individuals who are part and parcel of those communities. So addressing both the biodiversity and climate crisis, they're interconnected to be sure, but they also interconnect sort of the ecological, social communities of individual animals to be sure as well.
Yeah, we say in our grant, we've said in our Q&A about our grant program at Wild Animal Initiative that you can't assume that biodiversity is good for welfare. You can't just write, this will be good for welfare because it conserves biodiversity. But we're fascinated by people who want to do work about what the effects of increased biodiversity on animal welfare are, because I think that's a big unknown that's worth exploring more, and probably varies by context.
But we do know that the loss of biodiversity, whether it's extinctions or lack of abundance, is also going to have a negative effect on animal welfare.
I guess you could, I guess I don't really want to go into this towards the end, but I was going to say, I guess you could imagine that like being far less animals being born who are dying in infancy, I suppose it could be reasonable to say there might be less suffering, right?
I think it's hard to say what the net cost would be. It's certainly the case that an animal like a species going through an extinction, where more animals now are dying than were before, is worse for welfare for that
but
species.
But then
it's
less
unclear
animals being born in the future, yeah.
Yeah, it's unclear on net what the actual and total consequences are.
I understand and you make a valid point about you can have population levels of animals that are problematic.
I understand you're both researchers and you want to talk about practical things. I think it still might be fun to finish off by maybe like outlining what would be like your ideal nature. What would it look like ideally? Maybe Bill, you can go first. Like what would you love to see?
I'm an advocate of half Earth. So I would love 50% of the Earth to be rewilded, with buffer zones between that 50% and human beings, and then human beings maximizing maximizing the welfare of domesticated animals that we live with, and using harm reduction, whether that's harm elimination, harm minimization, harm mitigation, or actual restorative justice for the wild animals that live in those humanized landscapes.
And Michelle?
I don't know if I can answer this question. I think I have too much uncertainty. I mean, like taking my own preferences into account, I think that, many predators, for example, are beautiful and offer something deeply important to the world by their existence, just in virtue of showing us another way there is to be an animal and, expanding our understanding of what it means to be alive in this world. But of course, I think it's a pretty big problem that so many animals are harmed. So I guess the answer to what my perfect world would be one in which all individuals kind of, if we apply this to human society, we think about, can every child have opportunities to grow, live a good life? Maybe there's not no suffering in their life, but there's not so much that it really overwhelms them, and they're able to live through their natural lifespan and satisfy their needs and die feeling like, yep, had a good one. And I want every animal to have that. So that, if I had to paint my picture of what the perfect world is, every animal has that. I don't know what that looks like. Is it every animal that eats other animals is a scavenger instead of a carnivore? An active hunter. Is it actually we found out a bunch of stuff about how animals experience things that make us less concerned about this particular aspect. And no animal ever suffers from debilitating illness. Maybe they get a cold once in a while, they have the flu, whatever, but no serious illness. Like those are things that I can say I want. But like an exact picture of what it would be like to accomplish that, I don't have yet. So I would say personally what I'm looking for is every animal that is born does not suffer from a level of suffering that is just unmanageable. And instead, they get through their life and you know, and assuming we haven't also cured death and aging or something, you know, like, you know, maybe nobody dies either. I don't know. How out there should I get? But yeah, I don't know. That basically nobody suffers so badly.
We're going to need real fertility control.
Yeah. If nobody's dying, then we're really going to need the fertility control. I don't know. I have no idea what the picture looks like. I just know that I want every animal that is born to get through their life feeling reasonably good most of the time.
That sounds great. Thank you. Considering you weren't going to answer the question, like, I thought you did that really well. That was a wonderful picture. Thank you. Yeah, I guess from my perspective, I want the world to be a good place to live for all sentient beings. And like one question I like to ask myself is, how would I want the ecosystem to be if I were to be born into that ecosystem as a random animal? Pure bliss if I'm God. Pure bliss for all beings. But anyway, I really appreciate you both coming on. Thank you so much. You guys have been great, so thank you. And sorry, Michelle, for like talking about predation for so long. I want to put it out there that like that's just one form of suffering in nature, and there is lots and lots of other forms.
Definitely the things that are most interesting to discuss philosophically are the thorniest, and therefore the least likely to actually form a practical component of our work in nature.
Bill, where can people go to find out about your work?
Well, they can visit, if they want to visit my website, williamlynn.net. And we are in the process of setting up our think tank's website. So panworks.io. And Panworks is an ethics think tank for the well-being of animals.
And Michelle?
Yep, you can find Wild Animal Initiative at www.wildanimalinitiative.org.
Wonderful. Well, it's been fantastic speaking to you both, and thank you everyone for listening.
Yeah, thanks so much.
If you're still listening, you have reached the end of this podcast episode. I really hope you found value in it and enjoyed listening to it. It was certainly interesting to participate in. Just a reminder that you can support the podcast and my main channel by visiting patreon.com/humanehancock. With that said, thanks so much for watching. A big thank you to Bill and Michelle for coming on and sharing their perspectives, and I will see you very soon with another episode.